Okay, welcome back. We're at the fourth session of the Introductory Biostatistics Distance Learning course. This is the Stata practical associated with the lecture about probabilities, and this practical is going to focus on creating new variables. For example, when you have a continuous variable and you want to make it a categorical variable instead, how would you do that in statistical software? We're not going to show how to calculate specific probabilities in Stata because this is rarely done in practice. The lecture on probabilities is more to give you a theoretical foundation for some of the concepts that are to come. So the practical won't really correspond very closely to the lecture, but that will be the case going forward. I'll also try to make this practical short since the lecture on probabilities was so long. I think we ran an hour and 15 minutes when it was supposed to be 45, so we'll make this one shorter to compensate. Okay, so again, I'm working, hopefully you can see my Stata screen here. I'm working with the SEPO dataset, which we introduced in the last session about antiretroviral therapy among HIV-infected patients in Botswana. So the goal for this practicum is going to be to do basic data manipulations. So the biggest thing we want to do is generate new variables, and as I mentioned, sometimes we have a continuous variable that we want to categorize in some way or another. So that is the goal here. So one great example is the CD4 count. As we mentioned, the CD4 count is a measure of how well a patient's immune system is doing. So the lower the CD4 count, the worse off the patient is. A high CD4 count indicates a good, properly functioning immune system. And so experts in HIV have used the CD4 count to decide when antiretroviral therapy should be initiated. And the thresholds for when therapy should be initiated have changed over time. So people have used a threshold of 200, which is to say that if a patient has a CD4 count less than 200, he or she should start therapy. People have used thresholds of 350, so below 350 start therapy, and people have also used thresholds of 500. So this is a great case where there's a continuous variable, the CD4 count, which has kind of well-established categories in the literature because of these treatment initiation guidelines that have been developed by the World Health Organization as well as individual countries' recommendations and things like that. So here, you'll notice over here in the variables window, we have the baseline CD4 count, CD4. What if we wanted to categorize it in the same categories that we typically see in these treatment initiation guidelines? Well, we would have to generate a new variable. Okay, so how can we do that? We can do that, again, just like almost all things in Stata, we can either do it using the command window down here or with the drop-down menus up here. Okay, so first I'll illustrate this with the command windows and then with the drop-down menus. So the first thing I'm going to do is just create a new variable, and to do that I'm going to go to the command window and type generate, and then you type in the name you'd like the variable to take. So here I'm creating a categorical equivalent of CD4, so I'll just call it CD4 cat. Okay, and then I'm going to say CD4 cat equals dot. Okay, so dot in Stata's notation means missing. And you can see once I type that in, it's at 650 missing values generated. It's 650 because that's the number of patients we have in this data set. Okay, so I'll talk about why I did it this way in a little while. You could do it another way, but I think this is probably a good way to do it so as to avoid errors going forward. Okay, so all I did was created a new variable that's missing for everybody. Okay, and it's called CD4 cat. Okay, so now I'll say replace CD4 cat equals 1 if CD4 is less than 200. Why don't we just say less than or equal to 200? Okay? Now, you can see here Stata is now telling me that 330 real changes were made. That means 330 of these 650 patients had CD4 counts less than 200. Okay? Now I want to create a second category for those who are between 200 and 350, the other important threshold. So now I'll type replace CD4 cat equals 2 if CD4 is greater than 200 and CD4 is less than or equal to 350. Okay? And you can see 320 real changes were made. Okay? So if I add these up, the 330 and the 320 here, it looks like that accounts for all 650 people. But just to be sure, I'll create another category for those greater than 350. So I'll say replace CD4 cat equals 3 if CD4 is greater than 350. And I'll hit enter. And you see 0 real changes were made. So what that tells me is that this is a relatively sick cohort because, or unhealthy, or with advanced HIV disease, because nobody has a CD4 count greater than 350. They're all below that threshold. Okay? So now we've made this change, and you can see that we have this new variable. So what can I do with the variable? Now it's a categorical or nominal variable, and you'll remember that when we work with these types of things, we summarize them using proportions. And we learned last time the command tabulate. So I can write tabulate CD4 cat and hit enter. And you can see 330 or 50.77% of our sample have the category 1. Remember, I defined the category 1 to be those who have CD4 counts less than or equal to 200. And 320 of them, just like we learned when it said the changes were made, 320 people have CD4 counts between 200 and 350. Okay? So you can see how we started with a continuous variable and then converted it instead into a categorical variable. So again, what if I didn't know these commands? Because you wouldn't just know them off the top of your head. What if I didn't know these commands and I wanted to do the same function using the drop-down menus? How would I do that? Well, I would go into data, because this is a kind of a data manipulation that we're trying to do. And then I'd go create or change data and create new variable. Okay? All right. So let's do that. And so now, just for purposes of illustration, I'm going to create a new variable called CD4cat2. Specify a value or an expression, it tells me. Remember, I'm going to hit period or dot to tell it to make it missing for everybody. Looks like I could just choose this option too, fill with missing data. Why don't I choose that? And you can see it did the exact same thing I did previously. Generate CD4cat equals dot, so that it's missing for everybody. Okay? Good. Now, if I want to make further changes to it, I mean, I don't want to just leave it completely blank. I go again in my drop-down menus to data, create or change data, and now I want to change the contents of variable. Okay? So I have this here, and I drop down the menu until I can find CD4cat2, which is at the very bottom because it's a new variable that I created. Okay, then I'll click on if in here, and then I'll write if, so I want it to be if CD4 is less than or equal to 200. I'll hit OK. New contents must be filled in. Okay, so I have to go back to the main menu. That's right. So all I did was I told it was CD4 cat, and if it's less than 200, but I didn't say what value it should assign if it was less than 200. So I want those people to get a 1. And now I'll hit OK. Okay. So now you can see it did the exact same thing we did before. Replace CD4 cat 2 equals 1 if CD4 is less than 200. Similarly, for the next step, I would just go data, create or change data, change contents of variable. CD4 cat 2 is already in there from my previous work with it. Now I'll just type in 2, and I want to give a value of 2 for those if CD4, now I want to be greater than 200, and CD4 is less than or equal to 350. And I'll hit OK. And there it is. And now, since I've covered everybody, I know that I have nobody with CD4 count greater than 350. I can again do tabulate CD4 cat 2. And you can see I get the same results that I got before. Okay? So this is a good way. This is something that comes up in practice all the time. You have a continuous variable, and just for ease of interpretation, or because there are, like in this case, there were meaningful clinical thresholds, we wanted to take a continuous variable and categorize it, and so that's what we did here. Okay, so that was a short Stata tutorial to go along with the long lecture. Okay, so I will see you in the next lecture.